If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying these stories, there's a link below to buy me a cup of coffee. This is the Chassidic Story Project with Barak Hullman, podcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. This podcast is sponsored by listeners just like you. To become a supporter of this podcast, please go to HasidicStory.com, HASIDIC story.com. You'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know. Shalom Aleichem, my sweetest friends. Another week, and this week I have two stories for you. Stories related to the holiday of Shavuot, which of course is coming up next week. And next week, because of Shavuot, there'll be a shorter episode than usual. Maybe longer, I don't know. Depends on how much time there is. But this week, I have the stories for you. And before I begin, I want to dedicate this podcast episode to the continued success of our soldiers in battle, wherever they are, Be'ezrat Hashem, the returning of all the hostages, whole, healthy, alive, God willing, the refuah shlema, the full recovery of everybody who's been injured or who is ill, the comforting of those that lost loved ones, and the continued unity of the Jewish people here in the land of Israel and all around the world. The Chassidim from an area outside of Shpole, where of course the great Tzaddik, the Shpoler Zaidi, lived. The Shpoler Zaidi, known as Rabbi Aryeh Leib, who passed away in 1811, who was a nickname given to him by the Heilige Baal Shem Tov at his circumcision. A story that I've told in another episode. The Baal Shem Tov nicknamed this little baby Zaidi grandfather, and it was a name that stuck. So the Chassidim of the Shpoler Zaidi had been suffering for many years under a cruel landlord, one of the high-ranking members of Poland's nobility, who owned all of the land where the Chassidim lived. And he didn't just torture the Jews, he also tortured the non-Jews by constantly raising their rent. And of course there was no way to pay the difference. But for the Jews, he had an extra special hatred. He would make the Jews who rented his property sing and dance in front of his friends during their drunken parties, just for entertainment, so that his friends could laugh at the Chassidim. He also tried to force businesses to stay open on Shabbos. And now recently, he had decreed that in all the buildings on his property, there had to be a picture of the man from Nazareth, the person who his religion was centered around. And that was really going too far. Over the years, whenever the Jewish tenants of this landlord would be in Shpole, they would ask the Rebbe to give them a bracha and to pray that somehow this tyrant of a landlord would leave them alone. But once he made the decree that they all needed a picture of that person in their homes and their properties, all of the Jewish tenants got together and they went en masse to the Shpoler Zaidi. And when the Rebbe heard this, he was furious. He said, I've been waiting a long time for that wicked man to change his evil ways, but this is just too much. I can't take this anymore. He's going to have to taught a lesson. So now the Chassidim were very excited. The Rebbe is going to teach him a lesson. And they said, Rebbe, what lesson are you going to teach him? And the Rebbe said, it's time for him to hear the 10 Commandments. There's no choice. So the Chassidim thought, well, Rebbe, he's probably heard the 10 Commandments before. After all, he is a Christian, and they do know a little bit about the Bible, but they had no idea what the Rebbe meant when he said, it's time for him to finally hear the 10 Commandments. And before anybody could ask the Rebbe what was his intention, he started giving instructions. He said, listen, I know that every year for Shavuot, all of you travel to the big city so that you can celebrate with a large congregation. But this year, I want everyone to stay in town, and you're going to gather at the home of the tenant that has the largest property. So we can set up a tarp, a big shaded area, and we'll all daven together for Shavuot. But before the holiday begins, I want you to send a small delegation to the Poritz and tell him that you're inviting him to come hear the festive morning prayers, and that he should bring all of his noble friends with him. And the nobleman will think, well, I like watching the Jews sing and dance, so wouldn't they sing and dance on their holiday? He decided that's a great idea. He'll bring along some food and some drinks. His friends will sit there and have a good laugh. And the Rebbe turns to the group of Jews that had come to him and he said, as for you, I want everyone to prepare yourselves for the holy occasion of receiving the Torah. I want you to go to the mikveh. I want you to prepare everything for the holiday. And I will join you so you have nothing to worry about. Now go home in peace and make your preparations and make sure the Puritz comes. So the Jews standing there were amazed. Nobody had the nerve to ask the Rebbe what he meant, so they quickly left the Rebbe's room and began doing what the Rebbe said. A small group of Jewish villagers went to invite the Puritz, and to their shock and surprise, he happily agreed. He never saw Jews davening before, and he figured if all these Jews were davening together, that would be a lot of fun for him and his fellow noblemen. He promised the Jewish delegation that he and all of his friends were going to attend. And then as soon as they left, he immediately began preparing a huge party for all of the Polish noblemen in the region. This was going to be the highlight of all their parties. They're going to watch the Jews praying, and it would take place on the ground of property that he leased to one of his tenants. So he sent out beautifully designed invitations, and on it he promised them lots of food, drink, and a highly amusing surprise. Everybody did as the Shpoler Zaidi said. They went to the mikveh, they prepared everything in advance, and when the day of Erev Shavuot came, the Rebbe showed up with a large number of Chassidim, and they realized that there wasn't going to be enough room on this farm for so many people. So the Rebbe pointed to a nearby hill, and they put up a huge tarp there, with a platform with a table on it for reading the Torah, and he said that's where we're going to daven. Shavuot morning arrived, and the grassy land around the hill was covered with hundreds of Jews waiting to see what the Rebbe meant when he said that it's time for the Puritz to hear the 10 Commandments. And they started davening early in the morning, and around 10 o'clock, a large number of Gentiles, dukes, counts, lords, all kinds of wealthy landowners and noblemen from the region all showed up. Some of them were a little drunk to start with, and they took their seats on the hill waiting for a wonderful surprise, just like their host had promised them. And of course the servants served them snacks and drinks, and everybody's waiting and watching. And finally the Rebbe goes on the platform to the bima and leads the prayers himself. And everyone was very quiet, and then they started davening with real fire and enthusiasm. And the Gentiles seeing an old man with a long beard covered with what they saw was an oversized sheet with strings hanging on it, which is of course really a tallis, and davening very loud and singing and shaking his hands and his whole body. They were all pretty drunk at that point, and they were laughing so hard. They were having a great time, just like the Puritz had promised. But when the Rebbe called out in a very loud voice, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, they all stopped laughing. It was like a lion had roared. They all started shaking from fear. Some of them had these nervous smiles on their faces. They thought, how could a weak Jew make them scared? But they could still feel the echo of the Rebbe's voice, even a few minutes later. And then everybody started davening Shmona Esrei, the silent prayer. And afterwards they sang Hallel and the Akdamot. And the Rebbe signaled for the Torah scroll to be brought out. And they rolled it to the Torah portion of Yitro for the Shavuot reading. And then he looked around the crowd, and it was clear that he was looking for somebody. And finally he settled on a very tall, distinguished-looking man that nobody had ever seen before. And the Shpoler Zaidi said, please come and be the Baal Koreh. Please be the person that reads the Torah. And everyone was surprised. They'd never seen this person before. But when he started reading, they never heard a voice like that before. It was both melodic and powerful. And when he reached the section of the 10 Commandments, even though it was a beautiful, clear spring day, without a cloud in the sky, perfect blue sky, suddenly the heavens darkened and thunder boomed, and everyone was scared. And then the Baal Koreh's voice went higher and more intense, and he said, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Asher hotzitecha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am God, who took you out of Egypt. One of the Jews standing next to the landlord, the Puritz, was going to translate word by word, but when he looked at them, it was clear that even though the Puritz could not read a single letter of Hebrew, he understood exactly what was being said. And then the reader continued, You may not have any other gods besides me. Don't make any statue or image. And the poet started trembling. He felt sick to his stomach. And now he thought about how he'd told all the Jews to put images of Christian worship in their homes and their businesses. And then he heard the words, "Remember the Sabbath day, that it should be holy." And when the Ban Koreh read these words, the poets felt that he couldn't breathe. His throat was blocked. He was trying to force the Jews to stay open on Shabbos. And then when he heard the words, "The seventh day is the holy Shabbos to Hashem," he thought that he was going to pass out. He looked at his friends who before were drunk and laughing, but some of them were actually passing out. And they were also sick to their stomachs. Somehow, even though they didn't know the Lashon HaKodesh, they were hearing each word as if they did. And after a few minutes, which felt like forever, the reading finished, and some of the noblemen recovered. They were deeply embarrassed, and one by one, they disappeared. Afterwards, they davened Musaf and finished davening, and everybody sat down to have a big meal. And between the courses, the Shpoler Zaidi said he would explain what happened. He said, "I assure you that the poets and the rest of his friends will remember this day for the rest of their lives, because today they heard the 10 Commandments. They will never bother you again." He said, "I tried with all my might to change the poets without having to call Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher himself, to come here and read the Torah, but I had no choice. The poets had gone too far, and you, my friends, have a great zchut, a great merit of having been here today when Moshe Rabbeinu himself came down from heaven to read the Torah." And all the Jews that were assembled there, they were amazed. Moshe Rabbeinu had just read the Torah, but the Rebbe had more. He said, "You should know that your landlord is not just a goy. He has a spark of Yitro, the priest of Midian, and of course Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law, who came and joined the Jews in the desert just before they got to Mount Sinai, and he acknowledged the oneness of God and that the Jews are his chosen people." And after the second night when the holiday ended, the poet sent messengers to request that the Rebbe come to see him. The Rebbe agreed and went into his castle, and the two of them sat together for many hours. The next morning, the Shpoler Zaidi returned home, but did not tell anyone what he had spoken about with the poets. But from that day on, the poets' attitude towards the Jews had changed dramatically. They were able to live in peace without these funny decrees. He lowered the rent on all their properties, and even paid for a shul to be built on the estate of one of the Jews who lived on his land. And he insisted that it be built on the spot on that hill where Moshe Rabbeinu had read the Torah. And years later, when the Shpoler Zaidi had already returned his holy soul to its maker, the poets would come to that synagogue every year on Shavuot, and quietly stand in the back, listening to the reading of the 10 Commandments. And those who remembered that miraculous day could see the lips of the poet silently moving, as if he was once again hearing the voice of Moshe Rabbeinu echoing across the hillside. One of the elderly Chassidim who had been present on that day would tell people, "The Shpoler Zaidi taught us something so important that day. Sometimes heaven has to speak so loud that even those that don't want to listen have no choice but to hear." You see, my sweetest friends, the Shpoler Zaidi understood that the same divine voice that was speaking at Mount Sinai is still speaking today, just waiting for us to hear it. And so on a hilltop that was meant to make fun of the Jews, it became a place of revelation, reminding us that Hashem can transform any place, even a poet's heart, into sacred ground where Hashem's voice can always be heard. have another story for you. This is a story that the great Rebbe, Reb Meir Premishlan, would tell every year on the holiday of Shavuot, just before the public reading of the Ten Commandments. And Reb Meir Premishlan, who lived from 1783 to 1850, really surprised me. If you go to my website, you'll see that I have many stories of Reb Meir Premishlan, many more than I ever imagined. So this is a story that he himself would tell every year on Shavuot. The story took place around 300 years ago in Vienna, during a time when the Jewish communities lived under the constant pressure of royal decrees and the threat of expulsion. The Austrian Empire was ruled by kings who had absolute power, and the Jewish communities existed because they tolerated them. And there was a king of Vienna who was very fond of his Jewish advisor and finance minister, the tzaddik and scholar Rabbi Shimshon Meir Wertheimer of Vienna, who lived from 1683 to 1724. Now, Reb Shimshon was a court Jew, something that I need to explain. These days we have the state of Israel, but before the state of Israel, the only power that the Jews had was somebody in a position of influence, and that was called a court Jew. If someone was called a court Jew, at least in modern times, it would be an insult. But in those days, a court Jew was a person of influence who served the royal family either as a financial advisor, a doctor, managing diplomatic relationships, and they were the bridge between the Jewish community and the royal court, and often used their position of power to protect their fellow Jews from persecution and expulsion. And Reb Shimshon was one of the wealthiest and most influential court Jews of his time, serving many of the Habsburg rulers and using his position to protect Jews across the Austrian Empire. And one day the king of Vienna turns to him and he says, "I have noticed that the Jewish people are persecuted more than any other nation, and that they've been in exile for a very long time. Rabbi Shimshon, why do you think that is? There must be a reason. Obviously, the Jews committed some grievous sin that caused this. What do you think?" And Reb Shimshon was looking at the king, somebody who had never known a lack of anything, was never vulnerable, had never experienced any real suffering, as opposed to him who had seen firsthand the pain that Jews inflicted on one another because they were just trying to survive. And his answer was, the Jews suffer because of baseless hatred and jealousy. There isn't shalom, there isn't peace amongst the Jews, and that's the reason that they're punished so much. And the king said, "I don't accept that. That's not an honest answer. I want to know the real reason that the Jewish people suffer. And if you don't give me a real reason in the next 3 days, I'm going to banish all of the Jews from Vienna." It's quite chutzpahdik, honestly. A man who had never known what it is to be powerless, to just be a normal person, or had ever been exiled himself. Then he told Reb Shimshon to get out of his presence. And the rabbi went home, and that night, before going to sleep, he made a she'elat chalom, a dream request. Now, only people that are on a great and high spiritual level can do something like this. Just before they go to sleep, they focus on a question and ask that Hashem answer the question in their dream. And in the morning, Reb Shimshon woke up with his answer. He heard in his dream, "Don't regret what you said. What you told the king is true and correct, and you will see in the end that the king will be convinced." That same day, the king was hunting in the forest with his servants. And in those days, royal hunting parties would go across the vast forest lands. Each person would find their own section to shoot wild animals. And recently there had been a snowstorm, so they knew that the animals would be looking for food. And after several hours of hunting, one by one, everyone started to return home, and everyone assumed that the king had already gone home with one of the other servants. But it turned out that the king was left behind, alone in the forest, and he didn't know how to get out on his own. For the first time in his life, this person who had never experienced powerlessness was now completely helpless. The sun was setting, and the king was trying to find his way out of the forest, which was now getting darker and darker. The same man that had commanded armies was now reduced to try to find any shelter he possibly could. And eventually he came to a river, and on the other side he saw lights, and he knew there had to be a village there. So he took off his heavy winter coat and his other clothes, just left his undergarments on, and swam across the river. And when he reached the other side, of course the river was freezing, and he was shivering and desperate, and he knocked on the first house. And The people look at this guy standing there in his underwear in the freezing cold, shivering. They thought he was a demon. Couldn't be, so they wouldn't let him in. So the king dragged himself to the next house and knocked on the door, but those people didn't want to let him in either. And so it was, he went house to house, door to door, and nobody would let him in. Because what would somebody be doing standing there, almost naked, in the snow? Obviously, it's some evil spirit or a demon, or it's a thief, who knows? But the king was getting desperate. He was already freezing, he was shaking, he was starting to turn blue, and no one in this village would help the king. Well, he definitely knew what it was to be vulnerable and powerless now. He came across the last house in the village, and he noticed that there was a mezuzah on the door, and he said, the Jewish people might have compassion on me, and he knocked on the door, and the homeowner sees a shivering person outside. He says, please come in, and the king comes in, and the Baal Habayit, the person who owned the house, he stoked up the fire, he gave the king some brandy to drink and some fresh clothes, gave him cake and cookies, and prepared a warm place for him to sleep next to the stove. And when the king complained that he was still cold, the Jew gave him his thick fur overcoat to use as a blanket. But the wife wasn't happy. She kept telling her husband, how can you let in somebody who's standing there in the snow, shivering in just his underwear? You realize he's a thief. He's going to steal your coat and everything in this house. The king, who was warming himself up by the fire, he heard everything. And he said, even in this house, when people are nice and saving my life, they still don't trust me. They're still scared I'm going to steal something. But the Baal Habayit ignored his wife, and he continued helping the king. He told his wife, don't worry, I'll stay up all night and keep an eye on him, make sure he doesn't steal anything. And in the morning, the king said, tell me, my friend, where am I? He said, you're in a village about 4 parsiot from Vienna, which is about 16 kilometers or 10 miles. So the king said, do you know a wagon driver that I can hire to take me there? And the Jew said to him, there's no need. I'm a wagon driver. I'll take you to the capital. And the king said, thank you, but you'll tell me how much I need to pay you. And as soon as I get home, I'll give you the money. So the Jew said, okay, the standard charge is 40 40. 4 40s. The king said, okay, I'll agree as long as I can wear your fur coat on the way, as I'm still freezing. And then the wagon driver's wife says, you see, I told you he's a thief. You're going to get to Vienna. He won't pay you the 4 40s. He won't pay you for the brandy or the pastries. And he's going to keep your coat. And maybe he's going to kill you. But the husband ignored his wife. And he sat with the king in the wagon. And the whole way, the wagon driver was saying, you know, we really struggle for money. And we're scared of being cheated. In every section of the journey, the king was learning more and more what it was to live with scarcity and to worry that somebody else might take what little you have. And when they finally reached Vienna, the driver said to the king, where shall I drop you off? And he said, take me to the king's palace. But the wagon driver was scared. He said, I might get in trouble for dropping you off there. And the king said, don't worry, I promise, we'll be fine. I'll explain everything soon. And when they arrived at the palace, the king quickly jumped out of the wagon, and without a word, he ran up the stairs to the entrance, still wearing the fur coat of the wagon driver. And the Jew sat there in his wagon, and he said, I can't believe it. My wife was right. This man just stole my coat, and he didn't even pay me the 4 40s. And a few minutes later, somebody tapped the wagon driver on his shoulder, and he said, come with me, the king wants to see you. And now he was even more scared. What kind of trap did this person lead him into? But he had no choice. The king called for him and he had to come. And when he gets to the king's chambers, the king sees that this simple Jew was totally overwhelmed by the immense wealth and beauty surrounding him. The same wealth that the king had taken for granted his whole life. And now, having known what it is to live without it, the king understood what this simple Jew was seeing, abundant beyond his imagination. And the king said to the Jew, do you recognize me? And he said, no, your highness, why would I recognize you? You're the king. The king was wearing his crown and sitting on his throne and surrounded by servants. Even though he had just seen him a few minutes before, he didn't recognize him. And the king said, I'm the person you helped last night. I got lost in the forest and you drove me back here. I didn't tell you because you wouldn't believe me, but I'm the king of Vienna and you helped me. You saved my life. And so now I want to give you a reward. You asked for 4 40s, but I want to give you much more than that. Tell me whatever you want and I'll give it to you. Now this was a very simple Jew, and he just stood there, shocked. The king remembered where this Jew came from. He knew what it was to be without anything, at least for a short amount of time. And he said to the Jew, I'll give you whatever you want. You helped me in a time of need, you saved my life. Whether it's wealth, honor, whatever you ask, I'll give it to you." And the Jew was quiet, but his mind started racing with possibilities. But then the king started to lose his patience. He said, "Listen, if you're not going to tell me what you want, I'm just going to give you the 440s, and that's it." And finally the Jew spoke up. He said, "Your Highness, you know I'm a wagon driver, and I'm also a merchant, and I drive around the towns and sell merchandise wholesale. But I have a problem. Wherever I go, there's another Jew who also goes to those places, and he sells the same things that I do, and he's taking away my livelihood. I want to ask the king to prohibit this person from going to the cities where I go." And the king couldn't believe what he was hearing. Here was a man who just saved his life, and he offered him anything in the world. And what does he want? He wants to take away another person's parnasa, another person's livelihood. The same person who was so generous and had rescued the king was now looking to make someone else miserable. And the king shouted, "You fool! I was going to give you endless wealth. If you had accepted my offer, you wouldn't even consider a person who's competing with you. But because of your jealousy and hatred, you're not capable of seeing past him." And at that moment, everything that Rabbi Shimshon had told the king started coming together for him. The king had just experienced the perfect parable. Here was the wagon driver who was so kind to a stranger, willing to take him in without hesitation. But when he's offered unlimited wealth, the first thought he has is to destroy another Jew's livelihood. He doesn't see his fellow merchant as somebody struggling like himself, but as a threat he has to get rid of. And the king understood what Rabbi Shimshon had said, that the Jews are being punished because they're more generous to strangers than their own people. That's the sinat chinam, the baseless hatred that Rabbi Shimshon was talking about. And the king's shock came about by witnessing this contradiction in real time, seeing how the same man that saved his life had a heart poisoned by jealousy towards his fellow Jew. And then the king summoned Rabbi Shimshon Meir. With his voice heavy from the weight of understanding, he said, "My dear friend, you are right. The reason that the Jews suffer is because of their undying hate and jealousy of each other. But Rabbi, now that I understand the problem, what wisdom can you give me to heal it? How can I change this Jew's fate and the fate of all of your people?" And Rabbi Shimshon looked at the king and he said, "Your Majesty, when this Jew feels that there isn't enough to go around, he sees his neighbor's success as his own loss. Give the wagon driver wealth, not just money, but the kind of abundance that can open his heart. And when a person has enough to help others, his jealousy will be transformed into generosity." And the king shouted to his servants, "Send for the wagon driver immediately." And the wagon driver, who hadn't even had a chance to start driving back home, is quickly brought again before the king. And again, he's shocked by the grandeur of the palace. And the king says to him, "My friend, I want to give you something that will not only change your life, but also your heart. I'm going to make you the royal supplier of grain for all of Vienna. You're going to have warehouses, workers, and wealth beyond your wildest dreams. But you have to employ the Jewish merchant that you wanted me to ban. You're going to make him your partner, not your competitor." And the wagon driver said, "But your Majesty, he's going to..." And the king interrupted him. And he said, "He will what? He's going to take away your customers? When you control all the grain for the entire city? He's going to make you poor when you have more wealth than 10 merchants? Where there's abundance, there's no need for jealousy." And so the wagon driver became one of the wealthiest people in Vienna, and his jealousy became generosity. The man who had once wanted to destroy another's livelihood became his greatest supporter, and the two of them helped Jewish families throughout the region. And years later, when people would speak about the transformation of the Jewish community in Vienna, it all started with how they began to help one another instead of compete with one another. And the Premishlan Rebbe, Reb Meir Premishlan, would tell the story every year on Shavuot, because the laws governing behavior, ben adam lechavero, between one person and another, are the main reason that Hashem gave us the Torah on Mount Sinai, even more so than ben adam lemakom, between us and Hashem. And today, my sweetest friends, we have the same thing here in Israel. Unfortunately, we have two groups that see the world in a different way. And so, Be'ezrat Hashem, may we learn from this parable to have open minds, abundance, and love for one another, which is really what Hashem wants from us by giving us the Torah. And so when I start off the podcast and I say, and the unity of the Jewish people here in the land of Israel and all around the world, that's really what I have in mind. And I hope Be'ezrat Hashem we'll all be able to receive the Torah this year, those that keep Shavuot and those that don't yet, and be able to truly love one another. And that love, Be'ezrat Hashem, will bring Mashiach Tzidkenu, bring the righteous Messiah, B'imheira b'yameinu, quickly in our time, Be'ezrat Hashem. Lai, 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 didi, lai, 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 didi, lai, 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 didi, lai, 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 didi, lai, lai, lai. Diddy die lie lie, diddy die lie lie, diddy die lie lie lie, diddy die lie lie, diddy die lie lie, diddy die lie lie lie, diddy die lie lie. Diddy die lie lie lie, diddy die lie lie, diddy die lie lie, diddy die lie lie lie, diddy die lie lie, diddy die lie lie, diddy die lie lie. Thank you so much for listening, my sweetest friends. I hope you have a beautiful Shabbos and a beautiful Shavuot and a beautiful week. And next week, I'll have some more stories for you, Be'ezrat Hashem. Until then, thank you to all the supporters of the podcast, every single one of you. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the listeners and all the people that say hi to me and tell me beautiful things. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And until next week, take care of yourselves and sei gesund.